Thank you, Yael. Thank you to everybody who's here, and thank you to everybody who's joining on Zoom. I'm Isaac, and I'm going to be talking about modeling the risks of salt-induced soil degradation. I think the first question that we need to ask here is, all right, then I'll turn off the camera. Why? Yeah, but if I stand over here, nobody will hear me. The microphone is not that great. Can you hear me now? Can somebody write in the chat? All right, so we're going to be talking about modeling the risks of salt-induced soil degradation, and the first question is, who cares? Why have I invested 4 years of a PhD to study this subject? Great. When we're cooking, we like to say that a little bit of salt brings out the taste. Unfortunately, when we're trying to grow food in the field, we know that's not the case. We know that when we have too much salt in the soil, it can lead to declines in yield. And so what I want to convince you here is that it's a major issue, salinity and sodicity. We need to be paying quite a bit of attention to it. Even more troubling is the effect that salinity and sodicity can have on soil structure. In an ideal agricultural system, we want our soil particles held together in nice aggregates. And when we introduce a lot of salt, particularly sodium, into the system, then we can have a situation where the bonds between the soil particles are broken apart. And now the easy infiltration of water and air into the root zone of the soil is prevented. And if water and air can't get to the root zone, obviously that is quite detrimental to plant growth. So this particular phenomenon is of particular concern because when it happens, it can be really difficult to reverse these changes in hydraulic conductivity, if you will. What's the scope of these issues around the world? Well, unfortunately, it's a hot and salty world. I ask your forgiveness now for the many bad puns that I'm going to sprinkle generously throughout this presentation. If we look at a map of the world, salinity and sodicity are quite widespread. We can notice that salinity and sodicity are particularly pressing in areas that are water scarce. And these are often areas that are also some of our most important food producing regions. So what happens in them is really important for global food supplies. And to make matters even more interesting, these regions are amongst those that are expected to be most affected by climate change, changes to precipitation patterns, rising temperatures. All of these have the potential to make salinity and sodicity even more of an environmental issue. So now to slowly get into my research, starting with the big picture or the coarse grain goals. What did we want to achieve? We wanted to study the effects of climate change and water scarcity on soils, particularly with the aim of understanding the risk of long-term soil degradation. And on a more micro level, or the finer grain goals, what we wanted to achieve was a greater understanding of the actual processes of salinity and sodicity, specifically with the aim, again, of preventing soil degradation. And we were really interested in this question of the extent to which soil degradation itself is an irreversible process. When we have that breakdown of the bonds between soil particles, to what extent can that actually be repaired? And to what extent, on what timescales does that happen? Our approach to these problems is done through modeling. We think that modeling has a lot of benefits. We're able to tackle complex problems, explore a lot of potential scenarios in a short amount of time. And the approach that we take in developing our models is to focus on, or to try to make the models as simple as possible. We want to have clear connections between the input and output, which is important for gaining insight and for conducting analysis to actually understand how these processes work. Another just a few comments on approach before I get into the actual material, the actual work I've conducted over the past 4 years. So when putting together a talk like this, I think there's a tension between wanting to, on the one hand, present the scientific details of what I've done, which in my case is a lot of math and a lot of computer equations. And on the other hand, trying to make the talk entertaining and accessible for as wide an audience as possible. I've gone towards the second end of that spectrum. And I point everybody to the 4 articles that we've published on this subject recently. And all of our code is available on GitHub. And of course, I'm available here for any questions that might come up during the talk. So chapter 1, we call the salt of the earth. Here, our goal was, or my goal right now is to introduce the SOT model to you. It's a model that we can use to study the salinity and sodicity dynamics in soils. The work that I'm going to talk about here was published in the journal Water Resources Research in 2020. And our major goal in this article was to develop a model that can be used to study salinity and sodicity dynamics under different irrigation and climate conditions. So the model itself, just to give you a really quick overview of how it works, we have 3 differential equations. The first one is for soil water content. Our soil water content can change as a result of irrigation, as a result of rainfall. These are our major inputs, but we could also have water that infiltrates the root zone system, the root zone, that's where we're concentrating, from groundwater. And then we lose water through leakage, through runoff, and through evapotranspiration. Of course, everything here is dependent on specific geographic locations and different soil characteristics. As water is entering and leaving our soil entering and leaving the root zone, then we're going to have changes in the chemical composition of the water in the root zone, because the water that's entering and leaving itself has different chemical composition. So our second differential equation focuses on that, and how the specific salinity concentration of the water in the root zone can either rise or fall. And as we have water of varying chemical composition entering and exiting the root zone, then we're going to have interaction with the soil surface itself, and an exchange of cations between the soil water and the soil particles. And so our third differential equation focuses on that exchange. And we simplify things. We focus on just 2 cations, sodium, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is associated with poor soil structure, and calcium, which is associated with healthier soil structure. The other really important thing that I wanted to mention while I'm introducing this article was that we also took the time to validate the model. A model is great, but if it doesn't match the results in reality, then we don't have much to work with. So we took measured results from a lysimeter experiment that was conducted in Portugal, and we tried to match up our model, the SOT model, and we also compared our results to simulated results in the well-known Hydra software. And you can see here, these are for the water dynamics in the 3 different lysimeters that they used over the course of 4 years. We have also salinity dynamics. They were each treated with different chemical composition irrigation water. We have sodicity dynamics, and we don't capture every single measured point perfectly. This is not a connect the dots game, but what we do succeed to capture is the general trends in the data, and that's our goal. We want a model that captures in general what's happening, because we're just trying to understand the overall trends of what's happening in the soil. So we developed this model that can be used to study salinity and sodicity dynamics. Again, to come back to the beginning with that nice video that Yuval prepared for us, where you see the soil particles, the bonds between them being broken. So the heart of our question that we're trying to investigate is how these change in dynamics, change in the salinity and sodicity dynamics affects the actual soil. And what I want to do in this next chapter of the talk is to go back to the salt mines, or to challenge some assumptions about how the salinity and acidicity dynamics affect soil structure. So the work that I'm going to talk about now was published in the journal Hess in 2021. And I think if we're going to talk about challenging assumptions, then it's helpful to start off with a quick comment on what the assumptions were. The state of the science when we began this project had been largely unchanged since McNeil published a series of articles in the late 1960s. And in these articles, McNeil took soil columns and applied water of varying chemical composition to the soil columns, measured the hydraulic conductivity as it declined, and then used those measurements to build an empirical model for how soil hydraulic conductivity might decline as a result of different chemical composition of water. That model is used in Hydrus and other modeling packages. It's really widely adapted. The most significant change to that work came in 2013 when Eslett and his colleagues in Australia introduced what I would just call an upgrade to the McNeil model. The McNeil model had been a one-size-fits-all approach to this question. It didn't take into account soil-specific differences, which we know or should expect to play quite an important role here. So Eslett developed a framework that can be used to parameterize this model so that it can account for soil-specific differences. But what Eslett and McNeil both do is to take measurements that studied only the decline in hydraulic conductivity, and then they develop models that say, okay, this is what happened when we studied decline. You can use basically the same framework, or not basically, exactly the same framework to predict increases in hydraulic conductivity, despite the fact that we know from field observations that this is probably not the case, that the path down does not look exactly the same as the path up. So what we wanted to do was to introduce a model that can account for these changes, that is capable of looking at these changes and that can account for hysteresis in the degradation and rehabilitation processes, and that also is capable of understanding the soil-specific differences that we should expect in these patterns. As inspiration, we looked to the field of magnetism and a framework developed by Prisach that has been widely used to study phenomenon that involve hysteresis. The basic idea of this framework rests on the idea of a hysteron. A hysteron is like a switch with different thresholds. I think the most apt metaphor is for the mazgan or air conditioning units that we're all familiar with. We turn them on and maybe we set the temperature to 25 degrees. The mazgan is not turning on and off every time the temperature slightly passes that threshold or slightly goes below that threshold. Maybe it starts to cool the room when the temperature gets to 26 degrees and stops cooling the room when the temperature drops to 24 degrees. So we have these thresholds. And the genius idea that Prisach introduced was to think of these on a geometrical plane. And I want to quickly show you why that's so useful. And for that, I need to exit the full screen, if I can. There we go. And bring up our widgets. So the idea here is that we want to be able to model changes that don't look exactly the same when they are going down as when they are going up. So here on the bottom, I have my input. And I start decreasing my input. This could be the salinity of the water or the SAR. And you see this declining red line. And you see on the right side, a triangle where the switches are being turned off from right to left. And now I bring it all the way down. And now I want to fill it back up. And when we fill it back up, we start filling it up from the bottom to the top. And just by that simple difference, we get a different degradation path than a rehabilitation path. We also want the ability to study soil-specific differences. So if we introduce an additional component, here we call it the weight function, where we give different weights to each of these switches. So now I can start again decreasing the input, and you see a steep decline on the left, the red line. Now I'm going to start increasing it, and as we fill going up, most of the weights are concentrated at the top of this triangle. So we have a very slow increase in the red line, and that's how we're able to capture soil-specific differences that might arise. So with this framework, we've achieved our two goals. We have an ability to look at how salinity and sodicity dynamics might include hysteresis, and we also have an ability to make this framework soil-specific. So the next thing that I want to do is to introduce a bit of experimental evidence that justifies this approach. For here, in this part of the talk, I'm going to be referencing an article that we just published in the journal Geoderma, and I give special thanks to Taiwo Adeyamo, a master's student up until recently in our group. He's now doing his PhD in stable care, who carried out the experimental work that you're going to see here. So what Taiwo did that was really unique was he conducted these soil column experiments, and he started off with these black curves that measured the declines in hydraulic conductivity as he decreased the salinity of the input water. And then what he did that was unique, that had never been done before, was he tried to go the other direction. All of these colored curves that you see in each of the panels, he tried to, after decreasing the hydraulic conductivity, apply water of, again, increasing salinity concentration, and measured the changes in hydraulic conductivity. And as you can see here, when he did that, the hydraulic conductivity did not change much. Clear evidence of the hysteresis phenomenon that we're trying to make the case for. I should note that the water being applied here had an SAR of 50, which is pretty high. But we repeated this, or Taiwo repeated this experiment with several different SAR composition water, and in all cases we saw clear evidence of hysteresis. So what can we do with these type of results? I can take the framework, the experimental results that Taiwo produces. I can develop a weight function that matches the parameters that we saw in that particular soil. And then the third panel here is me taking the weight function that I've developed and trying to re-replicate the experimental results. And I think what we see is a pretty nice match in the general trend, in the modeled results, and in the measured results. So to collect everything that we've presented so far, so we have a framework that can study the dynamics of salinity and sodicity. We have a model that can be used to study how there's hysteresis and soil-specific differences in changes in hydraulic conductivity. The next step, I think here I can see everybody's on the edge of their seats. We're going to get exciting, is to combine those two components and make the case for why hysteresis is really important and why you should examine every other result that doesn't include hysteresis with a grain of salt. The results that I'm going to present were just published a few months ago, again in Water Resources Research. And the main idea here was to really convince people that hysteresis is so important when we're trying to understand the risk of soil degradation. So we start off here with 6 different weight functions that we developed that characterize potential behaviors in soils. And what you can see is, depending on the weight function that you use, you get really differently shaped degradation curves. We have sometimes a degradation that looks really steep. In other cases, a soil that is resistant to degradation. And again, clear differences in rehabilitation. So sometimes the soil wants to rehabilitate really quickly. Other times, rehabilitation takes a longer path to get back to its original values. So we can take this framework that we've developed, and now we can start to run simulations that try to reflect the conditions that you would have in a typical semi-arid, arid region. We used rainfall data from an area around Beersheba. And so in Beersheba, you have a long dry season where agriculture would be treated with saline sodic irrigation water, and then a shorter rainy season where rainfall would occur. So we adapt that sort of setting, and we run for each of our 6 different weight functions 1,000 stochastic simulations so that we can capture the effects of climate variability. And so each of these little thin lines that you see here is one stochastic instance, and the thicker lines are the ensemble mean. And I think the trends are pretty clear. In the rainy season, depending on which weight function you use, you can get these events where there's a decline in the relative hydraulic conductivity of the soil. But depending on which weight function you use, you get really different magnitude of those events. When we use weight function A1 and A2, we don't see any degradation. When we use these green weight functions, then we get medium degree of degradation and C much larger degradation. And then you can see this contrast between how they respond when we reintroduce saline and sodic irrigation water. So a weight function that has a low propensity to rehabilitate, the relative hydraulic conductivity remains in a degraded state, whereas when it has a high propensity to rehabilitation, it can jump back up. And I just want to point out how massively this differs from the McNeil function, which has been the most traditionally used function to study this. Here you see every once in a while a really sharp decline in hydraulic conductivity. I point out that the scale here on the y-axis is much different than in the other graphs. And then the second that the chemical composition of the irrigation water is changed, the hydraulic conductivity jumps right back up because there's absolutely no hysteresis in these models. The importance of this for understanding the risk of actual degradation is large. So let's focus on the difference between C1 and C2. When we take a 10-year simulation, so we run the same framework for just a longer period, and we look at the relative hydraulic conductivity of our 1,000 simulations at the end, when we use the C1 weight function, which had a high propensity to rehabilitation, then we say, okay, no problem. There was no change to the system. When we use the C2 weight function, we see, wow, there was a serious problem here. And I can't tell you if we take the soil outside, which one it's more likely to resemble. But what I can tell you is if it resembles one or the other, then it makes a huge difference on my assessment of whether a particular irrigation regime is going to damage that soil. So if we don't take this into account, we're basically just shooting in the dark, hoping that things will work out. The same thing for trying to assess the likelihood of rehabilitation or how much time that will take. Depending on which weight function we use, we can get totally different estimates for how much time it's going to take to rehabilitate a soil that's already been degraded. Sometimes it could take 100 days, sometimes it could take 50 days, sometimes it can take 20 days. How do you know how much money it's going to cost you to rehabilitate a soil, how much money it's going to cost you to destroy a soil and have to rehabilitate it if you don't take hysteresis into account? So these are really important environmental issues. Finally, to end on a salty note, we want to talk about the effects of climate change on the risk of soil degradation. So the project that we're currently working on takes this framework that we've developed and tries to study the sensitivity of soil degradation risk and salinity and sodicity all together. And we're focusing on the San Joaquin Valley in California, familiar to many of you as at once one of the most important agricultural producing regions in the world, and at the same time also one of the most at risk of not being able to sustain that. So 1 second. If you see Felix, wish him congratulations on a baby girl. Okay, so the question that we're trying to investigate is the effect of climate change on salinity and sodicity risk. And this is just a quick analysis that we've started to try and do. We take the conditions typical in the San Joaquin Valley and run many stochastic simulations that take into account different individual rainfall years, different soil conditions, and then we can compare those to the same results with higher temperatures. And what you see, not surprising, the salinity concentration when the temperatures are higher increases, and that actually leads to a lower risk of soil degradation, because when we have a very high salinity concentration, then we know that can actually prevent the risk of soil degradation or decrease the risk of soil degradation. Of course, it should be mentioned that growing crops in soils with these conditions would be impossible, but we leave that fact aside for a second. And we want to take the same framework and now study more interesting variables, like the effect of different rainfall patterns. So a quick analysis that we did using a more rudimentary framework for hysteresis showed that when we have shorter, more intense rainfall seasons, that can cause rapid declines in the salinity of the soil. And when you have those rapid declines in salinity, but the sodicity remains higher, then that can trigger those declines in hydraulic conductivity that we are so concerned by. So the next step in our work will be to try and apply the same framework with changes in rainfall patterns. So just to bring everything to a conclusion, I hope I've convinced you that hysteresis is really important. When we use hysteresis, we can see a greater risk of degradation and more difficult rehabilitation in our models. But not to end only on a salty note, but also on a sweet note, if we have better tools for understanding these scientific issues, then we can also manage everything more effectively, and that can lead to more sustainable approaches to agriculture. And for the experimentalists out there, there's definitely more work